Okay, good afternoon. We are here in this rainy afternoon here in FIMI, Fondazione Enrico Mattei today. We can start our next seminar. The seminar is with Professor Paul Ekins. I will present as usual. I'm going to present as usual our list of seminars, and after I will introduce the professor, and after I leave the floor to Professor in order to introduce his paper, his presentation. I remember that this is the economic modeling seminars that we started in December with Professor Pindijk, after we had Professor Hill, Professor Zwart, and Professor Toll in January of 2021. After we continued with Professor Bergman, Gollier, Van der Proeg, and Professor Gerlach, Professor Phoebe Conduri before our Italian Association of Environmental Resource Economists conference in April, in which we had again Professor Pindijk and Professor William Nordhaus. We started after the conference with Professor Metcalf and Professor Stevens, and today we have Professor Ekins. After we will have a break for holiday, and we will start in September. October we have to finalize this, but with Professor Joseph Stiglitz. I remember that this is economic modeling seminars that is organized by Italian Association of Environmental Resource Economists, University of Brescia, Fondazione Enrico Mattei, in collaboration with European University Institute, Università di Siena, the Department of Environmental Science and Policy, University of Milan, and the Department of Economics of University of Padua. Today, here we have the pleasure to have here Professor Ekins. I thank you a lot, Professor, for being here. The title of presentation: Degrowth, Environmental Sustainability. In order to, I remember I read a very long CV of Professor. It's very long to say that he's a Professor of Resources and Environmental Policy at Bartlett School of Environmental Energy and Resources at the University College London. His research, his topics of his research is on energy, environment, economy, sustainable development assessment, resource productivity, sustainable energy use, environmental economy instruments, ecological tax reform, sustainable consumption, environmental, and trade. About his long biography, I've taken a little bit. I think the most important thing is in my mind, but it's very, very long. But now he's a director of UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources, a member of a UNEP International Resource Panel, co-director of the UK Energy Resource Center between 2004-2014, and then its deputy director between 2014 and 2018, chairman of the government-funded National Industry Symbiosis Program, that is NISP, that is the UK most successful program to improve resource productivity. From 2002 to 2008, he was a member of the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution. From 2015 to 2018, he was a member of the European Commission of high-level panel of the European Decarbonization Pathway Initiative, and from 2017 and 2019, he was a co-chair of UN Environment 6th edition of the Global Environmental Outlook, that is GO6. About his awards, in 1994, he received a Global 500 Award for Outstanding Environmental Achievement from the United Nations Environmental Programme. And in 2015, he was awarded an OBE, that is Officer of the Order of the British Empire, and the UK new here honor list for the services for environmental policy. About his research and his on page, there are the total number of publications is 466. I have taken a little bit some of these that are Nature, The Lancet, Ecological Economics and Energy Policy, Energy Environmental Science, Energy Economics, Environmental Resource Economics, among a very long list. So I've taken only more in line with our topics. About the books that is written or edited that are 12. We have Global Warming and Energy Demand. We have also Economic Growth and Environmental Sustainability. environmental tax reform. It is very, very important. So there's a long discussion here in Italy about environmental tax reform. Hydrogen energy, that is a new topic in this, especially also in this period. Energy 2050, and the last I've taken here is a global energy that issues potential and policy implication. I have to say that Professor Paul Ekins is also one of the most influential researcher and professor in the world and on environmental policy. So it's a pleasure and honor to have him here. Now it's a pleasure. I leave the floor to him, and thank you again to be here.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sergio. So my topic today is growth, degrowth, and environmental sustainability. It's a topic that I've been thinking about for a long time. Indeed, it was the subject of my PhD, and in one of my books, the environmental sustainability, economic growth and environmental sustainability, that was the outcome. And I thought really that was the conclusion of it, but I've been very surprised to see that degrowth has become a much discussed topic among scholars more recently, and so I've thought to revisit it, and that's what my presentation is going to be about today. So I'm going to define the terms growth and degrowth. I'm then going to ask, why are we interested in growth, and particularly economic growth, and what would be the implications of degrowth. I'm then going to try to unpack the sources of economic growth. As scholars of degrowth are often quick to point out, economic growth is a relatively recent phenomenon in human history. So we can sort of more or less date it from the Industrial Revolution, the 18th century, and of course humans have been around a lot longer than that. So in a way, it's interesting to ask, why over the last 200 or 300 years have we become, around the world, societies that experience economic growth. I'm then going to look at opportunities for resource efficiency, which is, as Sergio said, one of the topics that I've spent a lot of time in my academic life, and the implications of that for economic growth. I'm then going to look at deep decarbonization, going to net zero by 2050, and the implications for economic growth of that. And of course, it's often said by the scholars of degrowth that in order to reduce emissions to the extent that we clearly need to do, the rich countries will have to experience degrowth. And I'll then broaden it out from decarbonization into ideas of weak and strong sustainability and the need for investment in natural capital. And that will come back to one of the themes that I will touch earlier on, and then just have a slide of conclusions, and very much looking forward to the discussion, the questions and the comments that you may have. And I hope I will be provocative, and I hope that a number of you will disagree with me so that we can have a proper discussion about this very important topic. So, definitions of growth and degrowth. And one of my favorite ecological economists is Herman Daly, and he was fond always of talking about the pre-analytic vision. In other words, what mental model do you have in your mind of the economy? Because that will make a huge difference to how you come to think about it. And here we have two pre-analytic visions. On the left is the one that I largely was taught when I did my MSc in economics, that basically the economy is about a circular flow of money. And here we have a circular flow of money. And then every now and again, we have to worry about these things called externalities out here, which arise from the provision of resources and the need to absorb wastes. But actually, the focus is on this flow of money, and That's the great majority. I think in my MSc, I calculated that 1/600th of a 3-year course, which I was doing part-time, 1/600th was devoted to this issue of externalities, whereas the rest of the time was all on something else. I don't subscribe any longer to this pre-analytic vision, and I much prefer the pre-analytic vision on the right. And I prefer it because I think it is much more realistic. It actually is a better description of the important aspects of the world in which we live. So here we have a bounded biosphere, and so it is limited. The sun comes in, and that's the external source of energy which we need to overcome the second law of thermodynamics, which is the law of entropy. And of course, solar energy also leaves the planet and the atmosphere and goes back out into space. And it is this balance between energy in and energy out which determines the average global temperature. And of course, that is rising at the moment because more heat is being trapped. The biosphere provides very important source functions. It provides energy and materials to economic activity. It also provides ecosystem services such as climate regulation, such as the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, etc. And it provides them to human population and economic activity. As a result of these, we produce waste energy and wastes, so material wastes, and these of course can become pollution. And in the case of carbon emissions, of course, they are pollution and they are warming the atmosphere. And the history since economic growth began is that human economic activity is using more and more materials and more energy. So we have this materially growing economic subsystem, leaving less space for nature. And of course, we have not only the climate crisis, but the biodiversity and crisis of nature to cope with as well. And so you get, from this pre-analytic vision, you get a much clearer idea of the current situation of humanity and the planet on which we live than you do from this one. So that is the one that I'm going to proceed with in my discussion. So what kind of economy do we want? Well, more or less everyone wants a sustainable economy, and particularly in today's world, an environmentally sustainable economy. We didn't worry about that terribly much, even as little as 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when I started getting interested in the environment and economic activity. That was still a very, very minority interest, and most economists ignored it entirely. So we want an economy that has very low levels of carbon and other emissions to the atmosphere, that doesn't pollute land, fresh water, or seas. It has very high levels of resource productivity, which means that it delivers high levels of human value, and you can measure human value either in money or in other terms, and it's quite fashionable these days to talk about quality of life and well-being, and I'll talk a bit about that later, for a low throughput of energy and material resources. And this is because the throughput of energy and material resources, of course, disturbs the biosphere by the second law of thermodynamics, the increase of entropy. We want an economy that results in aggregate human activity remaining within local and planetary environmental limits. And many of you will know the literature on planetary boundaries, that doesn't damage human health. And of course, we're suffering a pandemic of air pollution around the world, not just COVID-19. Air pollution, as I learned from the UNEP's Global Environment Outlook, air pollution kills between 6 and 7 million people every year. So that's premature deaths. So very much comparable to what we might expect from COVID, but this goes on every year, and it has gone on every year for many years, and we don't seem to worry too much about it in many countries. It mustn't deplete renewable resources, and of course, many renewable resources, especially things like fish stocks and forests, are being depleted enormously, and the economy mustn't cause climate change or ecosystem degradation. And of course, it's doing both those things at the moment, because it takes due account of the values and human benefits which a stable environment, high environmental quality, and resilient ecosystems provide. So that's the kind of economy that I'm interested in understanding and devising policies that we can move towards. But the question then arises, how big can such an economy get? And what does big mean in this context? And big is a small word, but as we can see, actually, in this context, big can mean at least 3 different kinds of things. And one of my criticisms really of this whole literature, and it goes all the way back to Limits to Growth in 1972, is that when people write about growth, they very often don't say what kind of growth they are talking about. And perhaps they may start by talking about physical growth, but they then go on to actually talk about economic growth in the same breath. But of course, these two things are completely different. There is a link between them, but they are not the same thing. So physical growth is growth in the amount of matter and energy mobilized by the economy. And clearly, on a finite planet, indefinite growth is impossible in a finite physical system. And so when Herman Daly writes about the size of the economy being too big for the planet, that's what he means, that it's mobilizing more material and more energy than the biosphere can cope with the waste products of, or in resource terms, can supply. But that's not actually the kind of growth that most economists are interested in most of the time. They're interested in economic growth, the growth in money flows, incomes, value added, and expenditure. And you will know that GDP is calculated in one of those 3 ways, or sometimes in all 3 at the same time, and they should give the same answer. And there is no theoretical limit on this kind of growth. Now, what the degrowth scholars always point out, of course, is that there is a link between physical growth and economic growth. And historically, of course, this has been true. And one of the reasons it's been true is because we haven't worried about it. And in many countries, we still don't worry about it. So we don't try to put in place policies that will break the link. And we'll come to that idea in a minute. But those 2 kinds of growth are, again, quite different from the growth in human welfare. And human welfare, again, is a very complex concept. We might call it also well-being. We might even call it happiness. And it depends on many factors. Some of these are objective factors to do with financial situation, work, community, friends, health, obviously, and we can measure those things. Some of them are very subjective. So, for example, there are lots of people in both the UK and Italy who are feeling very happy at the moment because of football and the fact that there will be a match between these 2 countries on Sunday. Now, there's no real objective reason why people should feel as happy about that as they are, but as we see on our television screens, it makes some people feel enormously happy, and not just some, huge numbers of people. So human welfare is obviously dependent on more than just economic growth. It's dependent also on sustaining environmental functions. And the people who've been living through these awful heat waves in the northwest of America at the moment, they're beginning to experience just how much our welfare depends on having a stable and temperate climate. And the relationship between economic growth and welfare is pretty complicated. But I don't think I've ever met anyone who, given ceteris paribus, in other words, everything's the same, would rather have less money than more. There may be very spiritual people who like to go off and live as hermits and find money a great distraction, but that is not the experience of the great majority of the world, as we'll discuss in a minute. And that these three fundamental kinds of growth then have spawned this great literature. And two of the terms that we read about quite often is green growth, and I've defined green growth here. Increases in GDP, so green growth means economic growth that either keeps the economy within the safe operating space, if that's where we're starting from, which we're not, of course, at the moment, or moves it back towards this space. And if we are to experience green growth, we will require absolute decoupling, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. Then we have the concept of degrowth, which I've always understood to mean reductions in GDP, particularly in rich countries, to reduce environmental impacts, because adequate decoupling is seen to be impossible. But there is somehow an aspiration that we can have degrowth without reducing human welfare, that we can actually have lower size of the economy, so negative economic growth, but no reductions in human welfare. I've not experienced that myself in any economy. I find that when we go into degrowth, that's what we call a recession, and recessions are normally pretty stressful for large numbers of people, and we'll explain why that is in a minute. Unfortunately, in the degrowth literature, we continue this ambiguity and confusion about these terms. So there's quite an influential article by one of the leading scholars on degrowth, Georgos Kallis, and his colleagues in the annual review. And he actually defines in the sidebar of the article, defines his terms like this: degrowth, a process of political and social transformation that reduces a society's throughput. In other words, what I'm calling physical, the physical amount of matter, while improving the quality of life. So in that definition of degrowth, we don't see anything to do with GDP at all, because society's throughput is the physical amount of matter and energy. And he also then defines green growth as economic growth accompanied by a reduction of a society's throughput. And on those two definitions, degrowth and green growth would be consistent with each other, but elsewhere in the literature, and indeed elsewhere in that article, you find very clearly statements that degrowth is actually declining GDP from today's level in developed countries. We then get the statement later in the article: in practice, absolute decoupling is unlikely, even though relative decoupling is common. So this, of course, leads to confusion. Are degrowth and green growth, are they mutually exclusive? I had always understood them to be so, because green growth is increasing GDP and degrowth is decreasing GDP. But this, as I've found out during my own PhD, is very common in this literature, that people start by talking about one kind of growth and then moving into talking about another one. And that's annoying from a scholarly point of view. And I would invite everyone listening to this lecture actually to be on their guard about that, because it happens very often. The other thing I'd just like to explore a bit at this stage is, what is the role of income in quality of life? How important is income in quality of life? And particularly, we're faced with the empirical fact that the great majority of rich as well as poor people want more money. And whether it's bankers who are arguing for higher bonuses or for payoffs, or whether it's well-paid medical consultants about to go on strike in the UK in order to get a pay rise, or whether it's other workers in the National Health Service who similarly regard a 1% increase in their pay as completely inadequate, and then obviously down to people at the lower end of the income distribution. Everyone seems to be interested in more income, and yet in the degrowth literature you often find the statement that actually income is not important to quality of life, and that after a certain level more income doesn't matter in terms of quality of life. And I can only say that that while it is possible to construct data that suggests that, that doesn't seem to be the attitude and experience of people generally. So this is the decoupling idea. It comes from a publication of the International Resource Panel, of which I'm a member. And you can see the basic idea is pretty clear, that we have human well-being increasing, economic activity, GDP, increasing, and obviously contributing to human well-being, that goes along with increasing resource use, but less fast, and that's the phenomenon of relative decoupling. And again, this has happened through industrial development, although there was a period in the early 2000s when actually we saw a recoupling of resource use, particularly due to the very fast economic growth in China. And then the absolute decoupling of environmental impacts, where environmental impacts actually go down, despite the fact that human well-being and economic activity go up. And it's that absolute decoupling which degrowth scholars tend to say is not either possible or not possible to an adequate extent. Actually, they're just wrong in some empirical sense. So this is an article that a paper that came out in 2010, so it's not particularly recent. It looked at GDP and various air emissions from OECD countries from 1990 to 2005. And you will see that with 1990 being 100, all these countries experienced economic growth over this 15 years, some quicker than others. So Ireland had a particularly strong economic growth over this period. But all of them also experienced, with very few exceptions that are in the shaded cells, also experienced reductions in air emissions. So we saw huge reductions in sulfur dioxide emissions. Germany reduced its sulfur dioxide emissions over this period by 90%, even while its economy was growing by 23%. Similarly, it reduced its particulate emissions by 90%, even as it was experiencing economic growth. And of course, the reason for that was public policy. Public policy was very strict. I was living through the 1980s, and everyone was very worried about acid rain and forest dieback. Policies on sulfur emissions were pushed very strongly by the European Commission and by member state governments. And so they fell, and it wasn't just in Europe. We had similar policies in Japan. We had similar policies in the USA, so that again, despite strong economic growth, sulfur dioxide emissions fell. So this is a clear example of absolute decoupling. In fact, the only country where this didn't happen in my little sample here is Turkey. It's no surprise that it didn't happen, because of all these countries, Turkey has the lowest GDP. And we see again and again that with these local air pollutants, we do get this decoupling as countries get richer. The environmental Kuznets curve phenomenon, for which there's a fair bit of evidence for these local pollutants. Of course, the big exception there was carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide increased. So only 3 countries in this sample actually had absolute decoupling, where the carbon emissions decreased, and the rest experienced relative decoupling. So we look at Ireland with that huge economic growth. Well, CO2 increased, but by nothing like as much as the economy. And of course, there are 2 countries, Portugal and Turkey, where actually they experienced no decoupling at all, where actually emissions in those places increased at more or less the same rate or slightly faster than economic growth. So clearly the relationship between these air emissions and economic growth is very variable. And the evidence suggests that when you get very strong policy, you can get absolute decoupling, without having to have degrowth. The big question, of course, then is, can we do this for CO2, which is really important because of the climate? And the degrowth scholars tend to think that we can't. And I hope that I'm going to show you some evidence that suggests that we can. So why are we interested in this topic in the first place? What are the implications of degrowth? Well, economic growth actually delivers some pretty important advantages. It increases average incomes, and as I've said, the great majority of people, whether they're rich or poor, are interested in having higher incomes. Through these higher incomes, it increases tax revenues and the sustainable level of public services. And I don't know what it's like in Italy, but the political debate in UK is all about where do we find the public resources to have a better education system, a better health system, a better social security system, and more support for social care as people get older. Economic growth increases business profits, and I don't think I've ever met a businessman who isn't interested in increasing their profits. And because economic growth does have a link to employment, economic growth increases employment, and that's pretty important. Obviously, we could take productivity increases as increased leisure time, but and we indeed have done in these in industrial countries to some extent, but not so much in recent years. But you can understand, therefore, why it is that people are interested in economic growth and why it is such an important indicator. But of course, you can introduce counter arguments, as the degrowth scholars do. It doesn't necessarily increase human welfare, and there are indicators that suggest that. It can come to dominate over real policy priorities, such as improving health and education, although, as I've said, in countries like the UK, the level of health and education services which are publicly funded that we can get depend crucially on tax revenues, which are increased by economic growth. Clearly, economic growth does not reduce poverty and inequality, and you need strong policy to do that, and most countries do not have those policies in place. And it can increase the sustainable level of benefits and pensions, which are very important weapons against poverty. Economic growth can run up against social limits to growth, where you get increased demand, but you can't increase supply. So this is the concept of positional goods, very influential book. In my own economics education was a book called The Social Limits to Growth by Fred Hirsch. It was published in 1978. There are critics who say it promotes individualism, competitive behavior, status seeking, consumer culture, and undermines community and social cohesion and increases inequality. And indeed, money fetishism, as Herman Daly calls it, can do all those things, but it clearly doesn't need to do all those things. It's possible to have other values in life, and humans have very complex natures that include all those things, but all sorts of other things too. And so the conclusion I come to is on this debate is that there's no possible resolution of this debate, because it revolves around different ideological perspectives of the good life, and people just disagree as to what makes the good life. For some people, the good life depends on having lots of money and having several houses and yachts and lots of foreign holidays and everything, all the high consumption lifestyles that we witness. For other people, they're less interested in that, and they actually don't like some of these negative aspects of economic growth. And I find that among the scholars as well. So does economic growth make relatively rich people happier? Well, lots of religions have said no. And ISU, the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, or Genuine Progress Index, that was pioneered by Herman Daly and John Cobb in their book in 1989 for the Common Good, agrees with them, and lots of people have calculated that. And ISU always suggests that welfare doesn't rise with economic growth as after a certain level. But as I've said, people generally don't agree, and people generally want to get richer. And within countries, happiness is correlated with income and wealth. Between countries, not so much. There's a huge amount of evidence that more money is a major aspiration, even for very rich people. A fascinating thing is that most people imagine that they're poorer than they are in terms of their relative income position. So if you do surveys and you say the median income is whatever it may be in UK or Italy, something like 27,000 US dollars or a bit lower than that in euros, people will generally think that they are further down the income distribution than they actually are, and they want more money to improve that position. And then, of course, as we know, money is bound up with those other big drivers of human behavior, power and sex. Money gives you power, and many people have shown that money also makes you more sexually attractive. So if we come to the conclusion that more money doesn't necessarily make people happier, that may enable us to focus on other sources of happiness and indeed of lack of happiness, like mental health, for example. But it is simply not a political project that in the short term or even the medium term has any hope of success. And I speak as someone who used to be a member of the Green Party in the UK, and we spent a long time at elections knocking on doors, trying to persuade people that even if they said they wanted to be richer, they didn't really want to be richer, and what they wanted is other aspects of their quality of life. And I can say from my own experience that not many people were prepared to vote for that. And very interestingly, if we look at donut economics of Kate Raworth, and I'm a great fan of this, I think it's a very nice way of thinking about the economy, with this outer layer of the planetary boundaries, and then the social foundations, as she calls them, of what are basically the needs or essentials of human life, and saying that we need to operate within this light green space where everybody has the essentials, but we satisfy those essentials in ways that don't contravene the planetary boundaries. And this is from an article of hers in Lancet Planetary Health. No one falls short on life's essentials, while ensuring that collectively we don't overshoot our pressure on Earth's life-supporting systems. So that's fine. I think there's a lot to be said for that approach. But it then begs the question, first of all, what is the difference between life's essentials and people's wants? And everything I know about human needs when I worked on this academically is that human needs are not defined once and for all. So human needs include, for example, internet connections and mobile phones these days, which of course they didn't do 20 years ago. It's extraordinarily difficult to come up with definitions of sufficiency. And certainly people don't seem to experience sufficiency. And I remember reading a book back in the 1990s called How Much is Enough? And it turned out to be really difficult to define enough across many of these factors here. So if we're looking at health and education, for example, we can see that they expand with the new technologies that can keep people alive longer and longer. I've talked about networks, that they're adding new needs to human life, sort of more or less on a decadal way. We look at housing and the fact that a very common characteristic in developed countries is that when people have a small flat, they want a bigger one. When they have a big flat, they like a house. When they get a house, they want two houses, and a place for holidays by the sea, and a place in cities for their work, etc. And of course, for most people, work generates income, and income is required for many of these social floors, and there are other issues that require income as well. So just saying that we want this this social floor doesn't by any means mean that we don't need economic growth. And if we are saying that rich countries need to experience degrowth for various reasons, as scholars do, well, what exactly is it that we are wanting to give up out of all these things in the social floor? And it's politicians find that very, very difficult to persuade people that that's the case. So let's move on then, and I'm conscious that I'm spending rather longer on these early slides than I should be. Let's move on to the sources of economic growth. Where does it come from? Why does it occur? Well, we know from our growth theory, simple growth theory, the Ramsey model, the Solow model, that economic growth comes from investment in excess of depreciation. It comes from applied knowledge and innovation, the Solow residual. And what does this applied knowledge and innovation do that stimulates economic growth? It turns non-resources into resources. Very good example of that is fossil fuels. Fossil fuels have existed for millions of years, but it was only within the last 300 or 400 years that we turned this black stuff into a resource, into an energy resource that we could use for economic activity. It enables us to find better ways of doing things. And obviously, every firm in the country is always innovating and finding better ways of doing things. And it enables us to create new goods and services so that, for example, the internet revolution has been a huge stimulus of economic growth. And obviously, that was something that didn't exist at all 30 years ago. And this investment in knowledge and innovation is at an all-time high globally. There are more scientists and knowledge people alive now than at any previous time in history. There's no shortage of renewable energy if we knew how to harness it cost effectively. Lots of calculations about the amount of sunlight that comes in from the sun. And there's no shortage of materials if we knew how to manipulate and use them. So that, for example, transistors and semiconductors made from silicon, one of the most common elements, that wasn't a resource at all, really, until the last 20 or 30 years. But of course, this economic growth must be consistent with environmental sustainability, and it currently isn't. It requires decoupling of GDP growth from resource use and environmental impact. And the limits to growth debate hinges on whether this is possible. And the other issue that I'd just like to raise, which I never read from in degrowth scholars, is how would we achieve degrowth? We know that we can achieve degrowth through stupidity, as with the financial crisis, when banks and other financial sector actors didn't look closely enough at their derivatives and subprime mortgages, etc. We know that pandemics can produce degrowth. We could produce it through reduced working time, but the French experiment with reduced working time was not particularly successful, and it's extremely difficult to enforce. How on earth are you going to prevent an academic like me working for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, if I'm very interested in doing that? And what evidence is there in any major society that people would really embrace this, that they would rather have extra time, extra leisure time, and less money? I just don't know any. So there are these really important practical questions about degrowth. This is a model which I created in the book that's referenced there in order to try to explain my understanding of where growth came from. And just very quickly, we've got these four sources of capital, and really important that we focus on the natural capital here, that then combined in a production process, they produce goods, obviously, intermediate goods, investment and consumption goods. The investment goes back and builds up the stocks of capital. The consumption contributes to welfare. We unfortunately also get wastes and depreciation, which deplete the capital stock. So the capital stock has to be maintained in order to maintain a certain level of benefits and utility, and natural capital also provides these environmental services. So this is a kind of circular flow diagram that is comparable to the money flow diagram that I started off with, but which has a central place here for natural capital environmental services contributing to welfare and utility. And we can write all that, of course, in a very simple kind of production function where we've got capital, produce capital, labor, which is human capital, materials, energy, and environment, which are all natural capital. And I'm leaving out social and organizational capital because we haven't really worked out how to measure that terribly well. Therefore, one can envisage quite clearly that if we run down our stocks of natural capital, the M, N, and ENV here, then we will have an impact on economic growth. It will either grow less fast, or if we run that capital stock down far enough, we might get degrowth, not because we want it, but because the natural environment is no longer able to support it. And so we can see that economic growth, which is dy dt, it can either be increased through a change in the technology variable, dA dt, or a change in the functions of the capital stock. Innovation increases dA dt, investment increases dF dt, and of course we could invest much more in natural capital in order to allow natural capital to make a bigger contribution to economic growth. And the most obvious example of that is in fish stocks. Anyone who's studied natural resource economics will know that the best place to be is at the maximum sustainable yield in terms of the income over time that you generate. And fish stocks are currently much too low for maximum sustainable yield. So investment in the governance of fish stocks and in allowing fish stocks to grow would yield an increase in income. So we've got to stop reducing natural capital if we want our economy to keep growing. I'm going to jump over various slides now because otherwise we won't have any time for questions. But just give you this reference to some work that we did in trying really to discover what the really important aspects of a green economy were: innovation, infrastructure, and information, with macroeconomic strategy, industrial strategy, and environmental tax reform underpinned by credible policies. And I'm going to skip over some of the detail of that until we come to one of the aspects of that, which was resource efficiency and productivity. There have been lots of studies, mainly by consultants, that suggest there's enormous opportunity for increased resource efficiency or productivity, where you define resource productivity in just the same way as you define labor productivity, the value created per ton or whatever of resources. Obviously, these benefit calculations depend on the prices of resources, and some of them were carried out at the time when resources were very expensive, at the height of the commodity super cycle. But nevertheless, a lot of evidence that we can increase resource productivity at negative cost. And I was one of the main authors of this report for the G7 from the International Resource Panel, and we discovered through the modeling that we did that we could reduce global resource extraction by up to 20%, but we could simultaneously cut global greenhouse gas emissions by around 60%, and this would increase world economic activity by 1%. So far from degrowth, it was actually growing faster than the business as usual path that we were on. So this was the map of greenhouse gas emissions. You needed strong climate policy in order to bring emissions down greatly, but if you added resource efficiency on top of that, you could reduce emissions even more. And here's the result in gross world product. It doesn't look very much, But what happened here was that by 2050, the resource efficiency policy was increasing GDP, or gross world product, by 6.5%, and that fully countered the 3.7% reduction that was due to the climate policy. These resource efficiency opportunities have been analysed in very great detail. So here we've got the top 15 categories of resource efficiency policy and the estimates of how much extra value resource efficiency could generate there. And of course, we can relate those to the Sustainable Development Goals in the way that the Business and Sustainable Development Commission did in 2017. And they calculated that resource efficiency could generate 12 trillion in business opportunities across just these 4 sectors: food and agriculture, cities, energy and materials, health and well-being. And then they evaluated some of the top opportunities there. So our conclusion from this report for the IRP was that there's substantial cost-effective opportunity for increased resource efficiency. Markets will not achieve that by themselves. We will need public policy, political will, and concerted action. And critically, as with any efficiency increase, that will tend to lead to a rebound effect, because it makes whatever it is that's becoming more efficient, it makes it relatively less expensive. And so you will need environmental and resource taxes to counter the rebound effects. And again, you quite often read degrowth scholars who say, well, resource efficiency isn't the answer because we will get rebound effects and that will increase the environmental impacts again. That's only if you don't put in place environment and resource taxes. Lots of policies that have been put forward and indeed have been introduced, but not strongly enough in order to increase resource efficiency. So we can be talking about circular economy, we can be talking about all the R's: reduce, reuse, recycle, etc., the waste hierarchy, extended producer responsibility, and industrial symbiosis, which, as Sergio said right at the beginning, was a major concern of mine for 5 years. And we can focus on products, or we can focus on wastes and resource management, or we can focus on consumers. And I'm having to accelerate through this. But there is an enormous amount of policy. And before they introduced their Circular Economy Action Plan, the European Commission commissioned this study from Cambridge Econometrics, which I was working as I've worked as a senior consultant for many years. And they tried to model what would be the outcomes of increased resource productivity through these sorts of policies, through market-based instruments such as tax, as I've explained the importance of that, through publicly funded investments and through privately funded investments. And what would happen to raw material consumption, RMC. And a really interesting set of results here. This is the baseline where you've got resource productivity improving by 14% over 2014 to 2030. This study was done in 2014. You can try to increase that a bit with the S2 scenario, and that increases resource productivity by 15, and you can see that we get a significant increase in GDP. You can try to double that resource productivity improvement, increase it by 30% until 2030, and you can see you get even bigger increases in GDP from the baseline. But if you try to go much beyond that, then you start getting increased costs in the economy, and you find that you actually get reduced GDP compared to the baseline by the time you get to 2030. So the result was, of course, that Circular Economy Action Plan recommended that the European Union should adopt a target of 30% improvement in resource productivity over that period, a doubling of current rates. And the calculation was that would not only not lead to degrowth, but would increase growth above what it would have been in the baseline anyway. So this was the summary of the findings from that. 2 million additional jobs, boosting GDP by the amount that we saw, and an absolute decoupling of material consumption. And that's not the only evidence that suggests that resource efficiency, energy efficiency can achieve these results. And we've seen a number of other studies where that has been the case. Let's move on then quickly to the issue of deep decarbonization, because that's very often the issue that degrowth scholars say we can't achieve with a growing economy in rich countries. So we know what the policies need to be. The Stern Review articulated them quite clearly. We need carbon pricing, we need technology deployment, we need R&D for breakthrough technologies, we need regulation for efficiency, we need information about sustainable consumption, and we need to apply those basic policy approaches right across the environmental piece for water, materials, biodiversity and space, etc. And if we did all that, what would be the implications for economic growth? And I'm only going to talk about decarbonization because that's where most of the modeling has been done, but I see no real reason why the results shouldn't apply to other areas as well. So this figure comes from the New Climate Economy group, and they have gone in great detail through all the various technologies and options. You probably can't read those, it doesn't matter. You can always look up their report if you want to look at it in more detail. But they estimated with these blue bars here were the bars of net benefit from these investments, from low carbon investments, and that we could reduce emissions by 20 gigatons of CO2 equivalent a year through these positive measures that all had net benefits. Before we take the climate benefits into account, of course. Then there's a whole range of other other options which do result in net costs, and that's this curve down here and these options there. If we take the externalities into account, which are the red areas, particularly the externalities from air pollution, then you can see that we have a much bigger net benefit, and we can increase the benefit down to about 25 gigatons of carbon reduction. And of course, as you economists will know, the way you calculate the benefits of getting all the way over to here is 35. You look at the areas under the curves and you compare them, and you can see that the area of benefit is much greater than the area of cost. And again, we would expect on that analysis that decarbonization would lead to economic growth. You'll be familiar with the learning curves that show how the costs of renewable energy have come down dramatically over the last 10 years, so that they're now well within the range of fossil fuels. So decarbonizing through implementing these technologies should not cost any more than expanding the fossil fuel base. There's another diagram that shows very much the same thing with the levelized cost of energy there. We've got another diagram here from Irena that shows, again, solar photovoltaics, concentrating solar power, offshore wind and onshore wind, showing these huge reductions. And then on the other side, we see that although we say we're worried about climate change, actually we are still giving huge subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. So it's hardly surprising that we don't reduce carbon emissions as fast as we would like to when we are still subsidizing the use of fossil fuels. And these diagrams come from the International Monetary Fund, and here these orange ones are actual subsidies that are paid. So these are real cash transfers to fossil fuel producers. They amount to about 300 billion today. They were 500 billion about 10 years ago. So they are coming down, but they're still substantial, much more than we give a subsidy to renewable energies. And when you take the externalities into account, again, mainly air pollution, you can see that these subsidies, you may, whether or not you call those subsidies, that's still a very, very large cost from the use of fossil fuels. So when we put all that together in macroeconomic models, what do we get? Well, broadly from decarbonization, this was from the CERN review, we get a hit of 2 to 3% loss of economic growth down here. And what does that mean? Well, it simply means that if we started in 2007 with 3% GDP growth per year, it means that by the time we get to 2030, instead of the economy being 69% bigger than it would have been in 2007, it's only 64% bigger. And you've seen then that the rate of economic growth falls from 3% per annum to 2.8% per annum. Now, this is not degrowth. This is lower economic growth than we might otherwise experience, but it is anything but degrowth. And this kind of result is delivered from many other modeling exercises. This comes from the E3 modeling group in Athens, which shows right across every country in the world that decarbonization, deep decarbonization for a 2-degree scenario can take place with positive GDP growth and very much reduced emissions right across the world. This is the story that we also see in the IPCC database of emission pathways and the economic impacts of emission pathways. Again, these are lower growth rates than they might otherwise be. Decarbonization is not for free in these model analyses, but they're certainly not degrowth. You can see that we have gross world product growing across all these scenarios. I'm going to jump over now because I'm aware that we're right at the end of my time. Just spend a little bit of time on how it is that economists are now starting to try to take these issues into account. This is the World Bank's genuine savings idea, where we start with gross savings as a percent of gross national income. We then have to deduct the depreciation of fixed capital or manufactured capital. We then can add the education, the investment in human capital, and we then subtract depletion of natural resources and pollution damages. And on this graph, which is purely illustrative, you can see that we arrive at a negative genuine saving rate, which of course means that the capital stock is reducing and we are going to suffer problems of unsustainability. That doesn't seem to be what the data currently suggest. So this is across many different countries. We look at the natural capital of these green bars mainly underneath the line. So you can see we are depleting natural capital. But in almost all cases, that is outweighed by investments in human capital and in produced capital, so that the net addition to the capital stock are these dark green bars, and they remain positive. And it's results like that that make me very unsatisfied with the weak sustainability approach, because that's not what the science is telling us. And I've been spending a fair bit of my academic time trying to come up with a strong sustainability indicator that would reveal better where we are with regard to our use of planetary resources. And I'm not going to have time to go through this in any detail, but it relies essentially on defining environmental standards using science-based targets and comparing where we want to be with these standards with where we currently are, and comparing the trends over time to get there. And some work that's being done by one of my PhD students is actually doing this, calculating this index for European countries. And you can see there's a wide range of different performances against this index, which is an aggregate of 22 different environmental indicators. And we can split this up between the source, sink, life support, and human health and welfare functions, between the various aspects of what it is we're trying to do in terms of sustainability, or for the European Union as a whole. And you can see the grey dots are the different countries. And here we've got the different indicators, the different source indicators, the different sink function indicators. Very low score on climate change, as you would expect. Pretty low scores on terrestrial ecosystem health, that's loss of biodiversity. Pretty high scores on human health and welfare, because that relates very much to the air pollution indicators that we've seen that policy has been able to reduce quite dramatically. And a last slide really from the UNEP Green Economy report, a fascinating modeling exercise that suggested that investing in natural capital, which is this G2 scenario here, would actually lead to higher growth rates than either business as usual investment or having the same investments as you put in natural capital, but putting them into fixed capital. And that, of course, goes right back to the production function that I articulated at the beginning, where natural capital feeds into the production function. And if natural capital falls too low, then we're going to find that this has a negative impact on economic growth. So my conclusions: economic growth arises from a combination of net investment and innovation. The costs of low carbon energy are small and falling. There are substantial opportunities for increased resource efficiency. And when we do that, we get small impacts on economic growth, either positive or negative. Resource efficiency gives us positive economic growth. Some models show that decarbonization reduces economic growth, but nowhere does it suggest degrowth. Rebound effects can be prevented through resource and environmental taxes, and it would be helpful if the scientific community could come to an agreement what a single measure and target for environmental sustainability might be. And then my three strongest criticisms of degrowth: it not only is it not a necessary condition of either decarbonization or environmental sustainability, in fact, it could get in the way, because we need huge investments in environmental improvement. And what we know is that without economic growth, the private sector at least does not come up with these investments. Degrowth has no political constituency in any major country in the world. People don't seem to want it, and it's kind of a non-issue in the real world. And it only seems to be interesting to this small but very articulate group of scholars who seem to be honest, in my view, a bit divorced from real world debates and discussions. So that's me being provocative at the end, and I very much hope that that will give us the basis for some discussion. Now, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Your very interesting presentation. I have to say that the topic of your presentation is very, very interesting, because also we are speaking about growth and degrowth, and combined also with environmental policy. So first of all, I know that there are some questions now that we will write to you in chat. So, but before starting, I have a comment and a question. The comment is that if we think that we are, if you look at the forecast of the future with resources that are reducing, so is exhaustible, no? And so the idea is you have presented very well this idea. So the growth in the future, the innovation that can help in order to have a growth that can be more sustainable in some cases. But one important element is a word that is in your talk, that is inequality. Because and this I take two elements: inequality on the one end, on the other end, financial system. So you are in a period in which, after 2-3 crises, so we started in 2003, we are in a world in which we are increasing a lot the monetary policy. So we are increasing a lot of the quantity of money in the system, and the financial part, so the part of it is not real, so a real is not a nominal part, is becoming huge and huge and huge. That is creating also some, in my mind, is my point, my viewpoint is increasing the inequality, because it's there is a concentration of money in different in countries as also among countries, because for example China has the debt of US. The US is increasing its debt in order to push growth and to push growth again. And this is the first element, the link between inequality, financial system, and this idea of degrowth. The second point is the new order, which is we are starting now, but is the is combined with the previous element of my question, is related to these new policies that we are adopting now. So the debt is increasing a lot in my mind, in my viewpoint. So the question is, this could create some problem related to this new type of growth and degrowth for the future. Which is your viewpoint on the financial system, also related to this environmental policy? So, you know, there are also these green bonds, there are these new systems that are in order to push investment in green economy. So it's just, I don't know if it's clear. It's a long question, but
yeah, no, Sergio, and very, very important. Like you, I'm very concerned about inequality, and to me, this is one of the most important issues of our time, and I consistently vote for governments which say they will do something about inequality. Unfortunately, normally they're not elected, and we get conservative governments that are not interested in doing anything about inequality. But the one thing I know is that clearly resolving issues of inequality is politically difficult. All governments, even left of centre governments, struggle with it because rich people don't want to give up their incomes or their wealth in order to increase investments in health and education that would enable poor people to make more of their lives. But under those circumstances, it's much easier to address these issues in a context of growth rather than degrowth, because at least we have the option in a growing economy of channeling more to poor people than rich people. Now, that links to the financial sector because, of course, what happens at the moment is completely the opposite. But most of the growth goes to people who are already rich, particularly through the operation of the financial sector. And that's a very big problem. But to me, I don't see that degrowth solves that problem. We would like to have real economic growth, so not just through financialization. And we would like more of that economic growth to go to poor people than it currently does. But with degrowth, I think you would find that the political problem was even bigger, because in a shrinking economy, the only way you can get redistribution is by taking very large quantities away from richer people. And what we know is that richer people are not going to be just sit back and allow governments to do that. They will fight back, and they have political power. So I don't see how degrowth solves that problem. The financial sector, I mean, again, is a different problem, and we seem fated in Western countries to go through a cycle of financial regulation and then financial deregulation until we have a financial crisis, and then more financial regulation. And we've seen that several times. The big bang of back in the 1980s, and the financial deregulation that occurred after that, and then the various crises in Asia, and another one then obviously the big one in 2008, and then the re-regulation of the European financial sector at least, and now we can see that starting to be unpicked. I think COVID obviously has increased indebtedness enormously. The opportunity from COVID and the huge sums of money that governments have been prepared to put into recovery is that it is a one-off opportunity to invest in a green economy. If we miss this opportunity to put these huge recovery funds into decarbonization and into natural capital. We will never have another opportunity like that, and undoubtedly the environmental system will have some very nasty shocks for us in future years. So it really is an enormously important moment, and the signs at the moment are not good. At the moment, a very small proportion of recovery funds around the world are being invested in decarbonization and natural capital. And we all need to look at what's happening with the Green Deal, because the Green Deal is Europe's effort to move in this direction. And if we manage to do it, then we will have made a very big advance.
Okay, thank you for your answer. Now there are some questions that we will copy and send to you by chat. So
I'm reading the first one, which is about I mean, quite a complicated but very interesting question about, do we need to include information in our flow models, really? Yeah, I think it is really important to include information, because, of course, information is the stuff of innovation. That's what we as academics do. We create knowledge, and if we're successful, this is then communicated to others who can put it to practical use. I'm not sure how I would include it in the diagrams that I put up there. I mean, obviously, information and knowledge is part of human capital, and so it enters into the production function in a really important way. And as we saw from the inclusive wealth diagrams, investment in human capital is the only thing at the moment that is hiding our huge unsustainability from a natural capital point of view. So yeah, information knowledge is really important. I'm not sure how to incorporate it into the diagram, so whoever asked the question, you might like to do that, and we can have a little discussion about it, because I think it's a very, very important factor.
Okay, thank you for this question. Now there is another one that we are sending to you again by chat.
No, they're not naive questions at all. They're really good questions. The questioner thinks he may be being naive. And he writes, it appears that degrowth is suggested as a substitute for environmental and innovation policies. And I think that's very largely true, because the degrowth scholars don't believe that environmental and innovation policies can achieve what needs to be achieved environmentally. And then the question is, are there scenarios or simulations assessing the evolution of environmental quality indicators in a degrowth scenario to compare them to a growth policy innovation-based scenario? And the answer to that is yes. There are efforts of that kind. Obviously, as with all models, it depends on the assumptions that you make. And if you just assume that the quality of growth in material and energy terms is unchanged, then degrowth, if you grow the economy by, degrow it by 5% a year or 2% a year or whatever it may be, then you can get 2 or 5% reductions in environmental impact every year, because the connections between those are pretty fixed. But what we know is that that is not how complex systems work generally, and that you get all sorts of other effects and consequences as a result of that. And there's not a great deal of modeling that I'm aware of that beyond the just IPAT equation of kind of saying impact is a product of population, affluence, and technology. And if you reduce affluence, but everything else stays the same, then you reduce impact by a similar proportion. Is there any explicit comparison between fossil and renewable energy subsidies worldwide? The answer to that must be yes, but I can't put my finger on the reference to it just at the moment. Of course, it depends to some extent what you mean by subsidy, and the IMF and the OECD have different definitions of subsidies for fossil fuels. For example, I showed the IMF one, and the OECD doesn't like including externalities in subsidies, so they have rather different numbers. But very difficult to know what is a subsidy to renewable energy, given that research and development is a very, very important aspect of that. Do you count that as a subsidy to renewable energy? Then you have things like feed-in tariffs and contracts for difference, and difficult to know, again, precisely how much of those numbers are to do with subsidies. Then you've got the issue of the fact that the electricity grid has to be different to absorb high quantities of renewable energy to if you have fossil fuel electricity. Do you count the upgrading of the grid? Is that a subsidy to renewable energy? So I'm sure there are good answers to all those questions, but I wouldn't be able to put my finger right now on a reference, but that's certainly something worth looking for.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. Now we are sending to you another one.
About decoupling and resource use environmental impact, do you believe that the next generation EU could be a way to achieve that? In a sense, the program finances loans and grants conditional on green projects being financed. The do no significant harm principle is core of the program. However, the broad goal of Next Generation is still economic growth, sometimes disregarding the other dimensions you explained. Yeah, I think it's interesting you call it Next Generation EU. I'm from what you describe, I would call that the taxonomy that is currently going through the European Commission. And I think that could be a very, very important way of steering investment into green growth as opposed to other growth. I'm not sure what you mean by disregarding the other dimensions, because the do no significant harm operates across 6 environmental themes: climate mitigation, adaptation, circular economy, water, biodiversity, and there's probably and pollution. And so if that is applied in a rigorous way, it seems to me that you ought to be able to avoid unintended consequences. And yes, the broad goal is still economic growth, because the European Commission, like everybody else in the real world, considers that increasing incomes are important for investment, and are important for public services, and are important for healthy businesses. So yeah, then there's a second part of this question. Even considering green investments only aimed at reducing CO2 emissions, in the short term, it is inevitable that these will actually increase emissions. More investments means more GDP per capita, more consumption, and in general, more impact on the environment. So these are very well put kind of degrowth arguments. And then maybe in the long term, and with technological advances, carbon efficiency will increase. However, in the short term, I believe the environmental outcome will be a negative one. What is your take on this? Thank you for the great presentation, though it's clear that this questioner doesn't necessarily agree with me, which is fine. I mean, I think I would, it depends what you mean by the very short term. Obviously, we know that if we're building wind turbines, we need steel. At the moment, steel is a very carbon intensive material, and therefore, if we increase steel production, we're going to increase carbon emissions. But at the same time, if from the output of the wind turbines, and this isn't a very long-term business. You can put up a lot of wind turbines in a few years. If at the same time we're shutting coal mines and reducing coal-fired electricity, then we're reducing carbon emissions from coal electricity much more quickly than we're increasing it from steel manufacture. And of course, in the medium term, we're looking at decarbonizing steel manufacture. So I was speaking at a seminar earlier today, particularly on decarbonizing heavy industry. And there are several demonstration projects around Europe that are going to start producing zero carbon steel from the middle of this decade. Now, that's not tomorrow, I accept that. And getting to that point will require some investments and will require increased carbon emissions over that period. But after that, when we start producing zero carbon steel and getting coking coal out of the industrial system, we can see enormously reduced carbon emissions. So I just don't accept the hypothesis in the question that these investments in a green economy in the short term are going to lead to increased emissions. I think that we're going to start getting the carbon payback from resource efficiency or from decarbonization investments much more quickly than that. And if we use environmental taxation, we can ensure that we're also avoiding the rebound effect and discouraging people from doing some of the things that are most carbon intensive. I mean, there's a widespread discussion at the moment on the possibility of an aviation tax in Europe. Obviously, the growth of aviation is completely inconsistent at the moment with reducing carbon emissions. And by taxing that, and 15% of people in the UK produce 70% of the flights. Well, if they can reduce their flights by 3 or 4 per year, then immediately through that means we can get some of the carbon emission reductions that we need. So I think there's a much longer conversation to be had with this questioner at some point, perhaps over a glass of wine, if I knew who it was next time I'm in Italy. But those are my initial thoughts in response to that.
Okay, thank you. You are formally invited here to discuss on this point. Now we have other 3 questions. So
I'm very happy to continue the questions. So okay, the 4th question is, what do I think is the role of human population growth in environmental sustainability? And that's again a very, very good question. And you will know from the IPAT equation that population sits in there. The good news is that population growth has been slowing in the last 20 years. I remember when I started thinking about these issues in 1990, the mean projection for population in 2050 was well over 12 billion, and it's now between 9 and 10 billion. So it's already come down. I wish that CO2 emissions had come down by the same amount. But obviously, population growth is a very, very sensitive question. Normally, when people in rich countries talk about population growth, they mean that people in poor countries should have fewer children. And very often, these are brown or black people who should have fewer children. And that's, I mean, apart from being deeply racist, it also overlooks the fact that an average person in a rich country will do much, much more environmental damage than an average person in a poor country. So my son, and I only have one son, one child, but he will produce more environmental damage in his lifetime than probably 10 Bangladeshis. So it seems a bit much to be telling Bangladesh that they should be having fewer children, when in fact it's rich country children who actually produce the main problem. If we could get in rich countries family size to reduce from, which already of course it has, but to reduce further, that would have much more benefit than reducing population overall. Having said that, of course, in poor countries, they want to get richer. So people in Bangladesh and in India and in China, they want to consume the way we do. And there's no reason why they shouldn't, or at least there's no reason why we should say that they shouldn't. And so overall, reducing population growth would be a good thing. Again, the good news is that as women especially get richer, they tend to want to have fewer children. They like to do other things with their lives. And we can see that demographic transition around the world over and over again. But if women have control over their bodies, if they can use contraception, and they are given economic opportunities, they tend not to have lots and lots of children. They like to do other things with their lives. And I think we can all appreciate that. So yeah, it's a difficult and sensitive topic, and one that encourages you know, big emotions. But those are my thoughts about it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So there is a okay. It's arriving another question.
Fifth question. Focus should be on consumers. Do I think that promoting a change of perspective from their point of view could be a good starting point on the path towards sustainable growth? For instance, should researchers and policymakers as well work so that consumption choices preferences are driven more by welfare maximization rather than by their own income ones? Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, welfare is such a complicated topic. And I think the assumption in the question is that people pursue income even though it won't increase their welfare. And I certainly don't know anyone who thinks that is the case. I certainly don't know anyone who knowingly goes for more income in the knowledge that actually it won't increase their welfare. They may find that it doesn't increase their welfare. They may find that they're working too hard and that their family life is suffering and that they never see their children and all that stuff around work-life balance. But actually, I think people are pretty savvy about what increases their welfare. They behave in ways that I wouldn't behave, for example. So people play the lottery, even though the chances of winning large sums of money are vanishingly small, but some people do win. Nevertheless, the probabilities are such that you're almost certain to lose, obviously, because only a few people win. So I'm a bit doubtful of that thesis that people go for income even though they think it's not good for their welfare. On the consumption point, I think that's a really important question. And why is it that we are locked into deeply unsustainable forms of consumption? The United Nations processes have had something called Sustainable Consumption and Production Programs ever since the Earth Summit in 1992. And while we've come a long way on sustainable production, so that businesses have become much more efficient and much less environmentally destructive in many parts of the world, on sustainable consumption, we've made practically no progress at all. And many of the most attractive consumption patterns are, again, deeply unsustainable. So we're looking at fast fashion, where you buy a really, really cheap t-shirt that's been produced by more or less slave labor in some developing country, with enormous environmental impacts from the cotton growing or whatever it is, and then that t-shirt is just thrown away after 1 or 2 uses. And if you look at the quantity of textile waste in Europe or the United States, it's absolutely mind-boggling. And I've never understood that. I've never understood what the attraction of that form of consumption is, but it's clear that many people find it very attractive because that's what they do. And I think education is enormously important. I think social norms are enormously important. I think to get celebrities to start trying to change lifestyle patterns, it doesn't help, for example, when someone like Bill Gates writes a book on climate change, and in the book on climate change, he says, but I'm not going to give up my private jet, even though we know that private jets cause 20 times as much carbon pollution as even flying business class on a normal commercial flight. So while private jets are the aspiration for rich people and everyone wants to get rich, well, clearly we're in a bit of difficulty. And so changing those consumption patterns seems really quite important, but we've not made a lot of progress on it.
I agree. Yes. Okay, the last question now is in the chat.
Sixth question. Globalization is helping to reduce production costs and increase productivity. Hidden costs is the ecological footprint of different products. What do I think about revising a global model of production, consumption, recycling, and reverting back to more local scales? Which sectors in particular should follow a deglobalization pattern? Oh, another really, really interesting question. There's a long discussion to be had about that. Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, the ideal from an economist's point of view would be to internalize the externalities. And then you would get the things being produced more locally, where those externalities were being taken into account and they resulted in local goods being cheaper than goods with long supply chains. But as we see, that's an ideal situation, but it's not realistic. It doesn't happen because countries are always looking for competitive advantage. And one way of getting competitive advantage is to externalize your costs, especially when you don't experience those costs yourself. So that is a huge problem. What sectors do I think would benefit from localization? Bearing in mind that very often economies of scale are very important in terms of reducing environmental impacts per ton of product than anything else. I think my first answer is food, and I'm a great admirer of the revolution in food that I think Italy started, the slow food movement, so that we take more pleasure in our food, we took more time in our food, we try to eat seasonal produce from the country where we happen to be more often, and that seems to me to be likely very much to reduce environmental impacts. I think energy is another example where certainly renewable energy is probably best produced and consumed locally, rather than, for example, huge deforestation occurring with plantations and shipping biomass pellets about. So that's food and energy. Generally, I think it would be good if we took more care of the places where we live. I look forward to seeing far fewer cars in cities, for example, and for cities to become much more livable places. And cities could reduce their economic footprints enormously by people not feeling they had to rush around so much. And obviously, if they have cars in cities, they're going to use the cars outside cities, and so those things. So that's food and energy and mobility, which are three of the most intensive sectors. There may be other ways in which localization made sense environmentally as well, but I think we also need to bear in mind that comparative advantage in environmental matters as well is important, and it may well be that it's better to import certain things from certain places where they can be produced with lower environmental footprint. So I'm thinking, for example, of producing aluminium in Iceland from geothermal energy. Much better that we produce aluminium in Iceland with geothermal energy rather than that some country that has a lot of coal tries to produce aluminium from coal-fired electricity. So that's an example where localization probably wouldn't be a good thing. So again, these are complex issues and there are probably no generic answers to them, but we need to use our intelligence and look at them one by one and say, would localization be some kind of environmental solution? Do our life cycle assessment and come up with conclusions about that.
Okay, we can conclude here. Thank you very much, Paul, for this very interesting talk. So I again invite you when will be possible to come here. I thank you also all the participants, and so we will start in the future. Okay, for September with the next seminar. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.